Hello everyone, welcome to session 2 of LTEC 620 Visual Design. I want to begin by reviewing the results of the session 1 survey. Now the first question of the survey asked if you were familiar with the concepts related to visual literacy. And as you can see here, 8 people, or 38.1% of the 21 of you who completed the survey, answered neutral when it comes to your familiarity with the concepts of visual literacy. Another 9 people either disagreed or strongly disagreed with that premise. The second question asked if you were familiar with the theoretical aspects of graphic design. The largest portion of you said that you disagreed. 47.6% of you, or 10 of you, said that you disagreed, and another 3 of you strongly disagreed. On the flip side, we had 5 people either agree or strongly agree that you are familiar with the theoretical aspects of graphic design. In terms of the applied aspects, we see a similar pattern. The largest group disagreed at 28.6%, and we had another 3 people strongly disagree. And then we had 5 people in the middle at 23.5%. And then we had another 7 people say they either agree or strongly agree that they're familiar with the applied aspects of graphic design. The next question asked whether or not you're familiar with one or more graphics editing programs. And interestingly, 8 of you, or 38.1%, that's the green area shown there, agreed that you are familiar with graphics editing programs, at least one of them. And the next biggest group was the disagree, which was the red color at 23.8%. When asked if you consider yourself a visual designer, we had a tie between the strongly disagree and the agree. So we have a bit of a split here, and you can see no one said strongly agree. We can almost divide this pie chart up into quarters. And finally, the survey asked whether or not you know the difference between raster-based and vector-based graphics. And here we can see a large contingent of you, actually 13 people, strongly disagreed or disagreed that you know the difference. Now, I think it's important to review these results because we have a class of 21 people. There are other students in this class that have similar backgrounds and or feelings about these aspects of the course content. Now, I did want to spend a little bit of time talking about the difference between bitmap and vector graphics. Now, bitmap and raster are often used interchangeably. So let's talk a little bit about bitmap graphics. So you could think of bitmap graphics as really just being a large grid of squares. And images can be created by putting different colors in each of the squares in that grid. And when viewed from a distance, all of those individual squares blend together to create a photographic image. So here's a really simplistic example. So the first image on the left shows just an empty grid, and then the middle graphic shows that different colors populate the squares of that grid. And then if you zoom out far enough, that can actually be a part of or make up a very detailed photographic image. Now, the advantages of bitmap graphics or raster graphics is that they can be created with a digital camera, a scanner, or a paint program, such as Affinity Designer. Another advantage is they have subtle tones of gradation, so you can have a lot of detail and it can be very subtle and smooth and sharp. Also, bitmap graphics can have transparent backgrounds if you use the right format, such as the Portable Network Graphic format or the PNG. And then, of course, there's a wide selection of stock photos available that are bitmap graphics that you can use in your designs. Some of the disadvantages of bitmap graphics is this idea that bitmap graphics can't be enlarged without distorting or resulting in jagged edges. So take a look at the word raster here. And if we try to enlarge the E in that word, you can see that the E becomes fuzzy. It has jagged edges. It's not clean and crisp. That's the primary disadvantage of a bitmap graphic. You can make bitmap graphics smaller, you just can't make them larger. Another disadvantage is the file size for bitmap graphics can be quite large. Now let's contrast bitmap graphics with vector graphics. A vector graphic is one in which the shape of a line is defined by a mathematical expression. And that mathematical expression contains instructions that tell the software how to draw the points, lines, and paths of the image. So here's an example. You can see there are 3 blue dots. Those are points. And then there's a red line. That red line can be defined through a mathematical formula. Now, the advantage of vector graphics is that they're scalable, and the image, when you scale it up, will maintain its quality. It won't have any distortion or jagged edges. So if you look here at the E in vector, you can see that blows up without any loss of quality. Also, because vector graphics deal with mathematical expressions, the file size is usually much, much smaller. Vector graphics can also have transparent backgrounds, and they're ideal for work that needs to be displayed in really big or really small sizes. And a classic example is the use of fonts. One of the reasons that we can have very tiny 10 or 11 point font, as well as a much larger 48, 64, even 100 point font, is because most fonts used on computers today are vector graphics. Now, some of the disadvantages of vector graphics is that vector graphics often requires special software to create and edit the graphics or the images. In addition, usually vector graphics require a little bit more skill to create. And the selection of stock artwork that's out there in vector graphic format is much smaller compared to all of the bitmap graphics that are available in stock libraries. Now, I wanted to share all of that with you because I think it's important that you recognize that visual design often combines bitmap and vector graphics. So I just screen captured a couple examples here. On the left, you see Muse Magazine, which is a science and art magazine for kids. And you can see clearly there is a combination of both bitmap and vector graphics. Similarly, on the right, the National Geographic Channel has a new show called Mars, and you could imagine how that particular design is a combination of bitmap and vector graphics. Now, importantly, Affinity Designer offers both bitmap and vector graphic workspaces, and I know many of you are already aware of this. Okay, I want to pivot now to talk a little bit about this week's readings. And let's start with the Johnson piece and this idea that our perception is biased. Now, Johnson does a really nice job of arguing that human perception is biased due to our past, our present, and our future. In other words, our goals. And wonderfully, all of you touched upon those ideas in your analyses of the drugstore cowboy assignment. Of course, Johnson was talking about all of these biases because there are implications for design. And he summarized these implications into 3 kind of takeaways that are important for us to remember as we move forward in the class. The first one is this idea of avoiding ambiguity. And as an example of that, I captured JR's picture of the whiskey bottle. And I think this is an interesting example because the bottle is see-through, which allows the user, the potential buyer, to actually see the product, to look at its color, its tackiness, how it moves around in the bottle. And that is a very good idea to avoid ambiguity. It's kind of like the designers are saying, look at how beautiful our product is. Another implication for design is being consistent. And Elle pointed out the consistency that Colgate uses in their branding of their products. And she pointed out that all of those boxes have the same color, the same text font, and more or less the same shading. So it becomes very recognizable. And the point is, from a design perspective, is that consistency allows users to spot and recognize that brand very quickly and with minimal effort. Another implication for design is understand the goals of the users. Now, I captured this example from Katie's drugstore cowboy assignment, where we have this beverage called Peace Tea. And you could imagine, if we connect here, the goal of someone who might buy that is they just want a cold drink that's going to relax them. They want to peace out. They want to chill out. And so there's a nice connection there with perhaps someone reaching out and saying, my goal right now with buying a drink is to simply relax. I want to peace out. And so I hope you're seeing the connections between what we read about in the Johnson article and the assignment Cowboy Drugstore. Now, Ware takes a bit of a different tack. Ware really takes us down to the physiological level and presents a theory of vision that describes what makes something easy for humans to see. The article talks about this idea of feature level contrast. And there's plenty of examples that are based on empirical studies. And ultimately, the takeaway for us is that if we want to make something easy to find as designers, then we have to make it different from its surroundings using one of the primary visual channels. In other words, we should give it a color that's substantially different from something else. Or we might make it curved if everything else is straight. Or we might make something blink or move if everything else is static. And Ware helps us recognize that the reason those things are easy to see is because the hardware of the human visual system is designed to work that way. Some of the fun, of course, of the Where's Waldo series is it violates this idea that things are easy to see. And so by not making things very different, in other words, purposefully avoiding feature level contrast, it creates this engaging game where it's a challenge to look for Waldo amongst all the other busyness of the surrounding scene. I also want to talk a little bit about the importance of this idea that perception is both bottom up and top down. There was an interesting study by Alfred Yarbus, and basically what happened is they used an early form of eye tracking, and they asked participants to look at this famous painting, and they put subjects into two different scenarios. So the scenario on the left is they wanted the individuals to examine the painting freely. And on the scenario on the right, they asked the participants to assess the age of the characters. In other words, they gave them a very specific goal: assess the age of the characters in the painting. So the experimenters, Yarbus and colleagues, actually tracked eye movements of the participants. So take a look here on the left. These are the eye movements of a single subject asked to examine the painting freely. And so you can see what the individual looked at, and you can kind of trace the path of all of the different things that they looked at. Now, this is an example of kind of bottom-up processing, where the physical stimuli of the painting itself actually drove or influenced what the subject was looking at in the painting. Now, in contrast, now we're seeing here on the right the eye movements of a single subject asked to assess the ages of the characters. Now, in this case, we have top-down processing. The user came to the experience with the explicit goal of assessing the age of the characters. And notice the difference in the eye-tracking movements between the two tasks. Even though it's the same visual stimuli, the end result of what was looked at and for how long was quite a bit different. And this I like this example because I think it really illustrates how human perception is both bottom up and top down. Now, I just want to share with you one other fascinating study that is related to visual perception. And this is by Osgood and colleagues, and it's an early study from the 50s. And essentially the research question was, what descriptive terms do naive subjects use most frequently to evaluate visual stimuli? In other words, when you show somebody something that they've never seen before, how do they evaluate that stimuli or that stimuli? These were some of the sample descriptors that they let the participants in the study think about. So, for example, do you want to know, is this visual stimuli pleasant or unpleasant? Is it repeated or varied? Is it smooth or rough? Large or small, beautiful or ugly, low or high? What matters at the end of the day when somebody is seeing something for the first time? Now, the results of the study are absolutely fascinating. And so they found out that when humans evaluate something they haven't encountered before, they quickly decide on three factors. The first factor they called evaluation. In other words, is this thing good or bad? The next thing that humans evaluated was the potency of the thing. Is this thing weak or strong? And then thirdly, they talked about the activity of the thing. Is this thing passive or aggressive. And you can think about this from an evolutionary point of view. If you're out living in the wild somewhere and you see something that you've never seen before, the first thing you want to know, does this thing look good or bad? Is it weak or strong? And is it passive or aggressive? And of course, humans' ability to be able to evaluate all of that quickly and soundly would increase chances of survival. Now, you might be wondering yourself, why in the world is Dan talking about evolutionary psychology in the context of visual design? Well, I want to make the connection of evaluation, potency, and activity to visual impact. So here you can see some examples of the anti-smoking campaign. And these visual designs, of course, are designed on purpose to make you uneasy. They're designed with intention, and they're meant to tell you that smoking is bad, smoking is strong, and it is aggressive. And also, I wanted to show you the second one from the right, the one with the lines, just simply because we looked at the 5 lines. And I don't know if you can see it here, but the text in the circle says, cigarettes, just looking at them makes you sick. And of course, these lines have this kind of visceral, wavy feel to them. And all of that's accomplished just by using simple lines. Okay, so where are we going with all of this? That's probably what you're wondering. Now, of course, we're hanging out at the intersection of visual design and visual literacy. And so our path forward now is we're going to begin introducing principles of design, such as layout, alignment, hierarchy, proximity, balance, repetition, so on and so forth. Now, Williams, in his book, The Non-Designer's Design Book, argues that good design involves 3 things. Learning the principles of good design, which we are going to study the rest of the semester. Recognize when those principles of good design are not being used. And then subsequently, step 3, actually applying those principles of design. And so we are going to be learning about those principles, recognizing when they're not being used, and then importantly, applying them in our own designs. Okay, everyone, we're out of time for today. Have a great week, and I'll see you in Canvas.